Okay, great. Okay, anyway, this session is on understanding configuration management and how to override it. So my name is Deborah Fusetto. I am a technical architect at Forum One. In addition, I also work at the National, I work on the site for the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, as well as Oregon Soap Company, both Drupal sites. I've been working with Drupal since 2006 and been building websites for since 1996. So I've been working with Drupal for quite a long time. I currently live on my sailboat. I live and work on a sailboat with my husband and my 2 teenage boys. This picture here was taken in El Salvador a few years ago. However, I'm not on the boat. I decided to come visit my mom, and that is the background over here. She's a beer can collector. This is her Cabato collection, so I thought that would make a nice little background. So next, I'd like to know a little bit about you. I figure since I can't see anybody in person, I thought I would take advantage of the chat to maybe get to know a little bit of my audience. So if you could, in your chat, if you could just put in, where you're watching from. And that actually came a little bit early. As far as your level of expertise, you can put where you're watching from. What is your level of expertise? Looks like we've got, lots of people all over the country, world. Nice. And then level of expertise for D8. Anybody have any, just like a beginner, medium, expert? Yeah, great, New Orleans. But that's a lot of Maryland. I've spent a lot of time in Maryland. Lots of D8, that's great. That's great to hear. Looks like some medium experience. I'm assuming most people who have used Drupal 8 definitely has experience with configuration. And the last question, what do you miss most about being in person, or about not being in person? I'll tell you, the thing that I probably miss the most is the parties, the social events, the Lullabot party, the Pantheon parties, all the evening parties. Definitely hallway conversation. Yeah, board game night, definitely. Not being around your children, yeah, getting a little bit of a break. Great, all great answers. Awesome. There was a party at the Pantheon booth last night. That would be pretty, yeah, I missed that, but I've gone to a couple of virtual happy hours. Those work pretty well too. Great, that's, yeah, exploring a new city. Yeah, I've never been to Minneapolis. I was looking forward to going there, but it's nice to go to a new city every year. So hopefully we'll get to come back to that eventually. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So basically this session is mostly for developers, but it could also be for site builders and themers. There was actually a really good session yesterday on configuration management and Drupal for beginners. If you didn't go to that, that was probably be a good session to go back and watch, especially if you're a beginner, because it does cover some very beginner basics of configuration management. It was a pretty good session. And also there's a session later today called Models for Configuration Management, and might be a good follow-up for this session. So those are the only configuration management sessions that I saw. There might be a few others. So one disclaimer about my session. So because we are doing this virtual, I did decide to not do live demos, and instead I recorded them as animated GIFs. And this may or may not be a good thing for me. We'll have to see how it goes. One thing that I have found is maybe a problem is that they kind of start whenever they want to start. So hopefully I can get them started at the beginning. But I figured this would be better than having a live demo for just to save a little time, have them pre-recorded. I don't have to worry about accidentally, having something not work during the demo, as Murphy's Law always seems to indicate will happen. So what is configuration management? In a nutshell, it's a process for maintaining consistent configurations across multiple environments. In a typical development workflow, features and code go from your local environment to a development environment for like integration testing of all the development for developers, and then into a testing environment for final testing before pushing the changes to a production environment. So in Drupal 7, we manage this using features. Anyone who has used Drupal 7 or even previous versions have probably used features, and people may be familiar with a screen like this. This is a typical features page that you might see, and there was always a lot of overwritten needs review, conflict. It was really hard, in my opinion, to maintain, and for me, features kind of made me feel like this. Oh, hey, Harry, I tried to say hi to you the other day. Good to see you. Anyway, so great for Drupal 8 for me. One of my favorite things about Drupal 8 was being able to say goodbye to features, or at least only use features for what it was really meant to be. Features are really meant to be a way to package an actual feature, not just to store your configuration. So for me, Drupal 8 made me feel like this. Woohoo! So moving to Drupal 8 kind of forced me to understand what changes locally. We export our configuration, we commit it to our repo, and then push the code to our different environments and then import the configuration. So that's pretty much the lifestyle that we see. You know, we make the change on the site, usually through the UI or through Drush or whatever, and then you export your configurations, and then you commit them to a repository and then push them to other environments. So here is my first animated GIF here. So what you can see here is that we're making a change to the site name and then changing it. And then when we go into our command line and we do an export, we can see that a change to a file has been made. So you can see that a change has been made to the system.yaml. And then if you refresh your site, then that change is affected. And so if you wanted to change that site name, then you would commit that file to your Git repo and then push it up to your next environment. So I typically use Drush for importing and exporting, but you can also use the UI to do this as well. So you can use it in the command line like you saw in the previous screen using Drush, or you can go into your site yourself and go into the configuration synchronization. You can see that change has been made, and then click import from there, and that will import all your changes. Okay, slides are lagging a little bit. I'll wait a few seconds to see if it can catch up. So the slide I'm on right now is, so that's great. We have a way of pushing configuration now, but what if the configuration is different on staging and production? What if, maybe changing the site name is not a very common problem, but, there's a lot of other ones, a lot of other problems, a lot of examples of these kinds of problems. So some of the common examples of configuration changes might be your Solr or other search configurations. You may have in your development or non-production environment, you may be hooked up to a different search configuration that you may want to have configured in those environments. Also, SAML configuration, maybe in your production or your non-production environments, you want to have that disabled. Also with your two-factor configuration, that's again something that maybe you want to turn off. And then in the opposite, maybe the shield configuration is something actually you want to turn on. You want it on in your non-production environments, but you want it off in your production environment. And then there's also definitely a lot of caching issues that, you know, in your development environment, especially your local environment, you want to have these things turned off. So some other examples that you may want in different environments are enabling or disabling modules. So in your local and development environments, you might want your devel, you know, rerouting email. You want your fields and your, you know, your views UI turned on, but in your production environment, you want these turned off. So what is the solution? How can we override these configurations between environments? So there's actually quite a few ways that we can do this. Probably the most common way is using the settings.php file. So this is an example of what you might put in your settings.php file, probably a local settings.php file that is going to disable your CSS and your JavaScript caching. So this is definitely one way, and probably a very common way to do this. So this is basically, this is an example of another way that you might use your settings.php to set your site name. So you can go in and set your system site name by using, and basically if you see, I know this is going to go fast, but if you see the config array, the way that it's structured, you have system.site, and that's actually the name of the YAML file. And then the next piece of it is name, which is actually, if you look in the system.site YAML file, setting up as the starting, and giving it a value. So we'll kind of see this just one more time in case we missed it. Again, we're setting the configuration in the settings file, and the structure of the array for the config file matches the YAML file name in addition to the attributes that's inside of the file. So this is an important thing to understand when you're overriding configurations. So there's a few downsides for the settings.php. I mean, it's great for local configuration, but it can end up, you can really end up with a lot of conditions. And this next slide is an example of a real settings.php file that I've used in the past. And this isn't even the whole thing. I mean, this is just part of it. And you can see here that we have a switch. Okay, I'm seeing that you guys might be having a few issues with the animated GIFs. I'll let those play a little bit longer. Right now, I'm displaying the slide that has the example of the very long settings.php file. And again, this is just a snippet of it, but you can see how this can really grow with the amount of changes that you might put into the settings.php file. So another downside for using the settings.php file is that sometimes that settings.php file is not committed to code. It's, you know, maybe generated in a different way. I mean, I've definitely been on projects where we don't commit changes to a settings.php file. And so, you know, you wouldn't be able to put changes in there. And also the settings.php file does not allow you to enable and disable modules. So that's definitely a disadvantage. I mean, I definitely think the settings.php file has its uses, but you know, for doing enabling and disabling modules, it's not even possible in the settings.php file. So what is the solution for that? How can we enable or disable modules? Again, like with everything else, there's different ways to do that. One of the ways you can do that is using Composer. When you install your modules, you can use the dev option, and that puts it into the dev section. And so then you will only be able, you know, only those modules will be installed when you use that option in your Composer command. However, you have to remember to use it. So if you just do Composer install, it's not going to install them. So you have to remember to use the attributes in order to get those enabled. Another composer way is composer scripts. Composer scripts can be pretty powerful. You can do a lot of things with it. In this example here, you can run Drush commands that will enable these for you. You can also, clear cache and do many other things with composer scripts. But you do have to run the composer command in order to do it. To me, composer kind of makes me feel like this, though. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but it seems a lot more complex than it really needs to be, in my opinion. So to me, config split comes to the rescue. The config split module allows you to actually split your configuration into different groups based on your environment. And then you can enable and disable modules based on that. You can also have different configurations. You can have conditional configurations and many things. So config split can be very powerful and is a great solution for enabling and disabling modules. It does also require the config filter module as well. That is a requirement for that. So that makes me feel happy. I like config split. I think that some people, I think it's becoming a lot more important over the years. I mean, I think it's a lot more people have used config split over the years. A lot of people hadn't heard of it for a long time, but I think it's becoming more and more widely used. So how does config split work? So basically what you want to do is you want to determine, define what modules and configurations you want to split off. So determine what you want in production, what you want in your non-production or different environments. And then you want to disable the modules in the default configuration and then enable this, and then so the configuration that moves, which is like the main configuration, and then it's stored in your split directory. So the first thing you need to do is basically you need to enable the config split modules. So here we are enabling config split, and then you're going to also see that it's going to require the config filter module as well. So once you have your modules enabled, then you can start setting up your splits. And 1 second here, waiting for that to catch up. So once you have the modules enabled, you're going to see a configuration split settings here. And so you want to go into here and define your split. So, oh, did I lose my screen share? Something happened. Let's try again. Chrome tab. Is that sharing again? Something happened with it. I lost my hop-in. There, are we back? Okay, so here we are again. So configuration split settings. I don't know what happened there. So you're going to go to your configuration split settings. You're going to add a configuration split. And in this case, we're creating one called develop. So you give it a label and give it a description if you want. But this we are going to consider configuration for development environments. And then you're going to define a folder. This is usually a folder underneath the config folder in its own splits folder. You don't want to activate it at this point. So now you have a configuration split created. So if you now go into if you were to look into your configuration split or into your config management settings in the UI, you would now see that you have a change in there because you've added a configuration split, and that is actually a configuration that is that is stored in your system. So if we were to go into the command line, I'm doing a export of my configuration. You're going to see now that we have the core extensions was modified because we enabled the modules, and then we have this config split settings YAML file that has your configuration for the folder or for the configuration. So there's a question here: is the folder relative to the config folder or an absolute path? It's relative to the web root. So in my particular case here, I have the config file at the same level of the web root. Normally you wouldn't do that. You would probably have it, one level up. So you might have to do like, /config. And the folder that you actually name, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit as well, but I named it, I have splits, and then I also have sync. Sync is my main configuration, where split is my splits configuration. And that is, you don't have to name it that. You could name it whatever you want. That's just kind of a little bit more typical of what we might use. But you can name it whatever you want. You just have to make sure that that's what you define when you're creating your split. So so main configuration versus split configuration. So basically your main configuration is your global settings. That's your settings that it's going to be used for all of your different environments, where your split configuration overrides your global configuration. So you want to decide on your default settings. For example, you want your CSS and your JS aggregation, you want it enabled by default. And then in your non-production environments or your local environment, you want to disable it. Or you could do it vice versa. Your settings PHP. In this particular case, I have config/sync. However, you will not have it in the web root. And then your folder structure is something similar to this, where you have like, again, I have this under my web root for this particular demonstration, but you probably have it up a root. But then you have a sync folder, or sometimes I've called it default. And that is your main configuration. And then you have a splits folder, and then you have folders underneath that have your individual splits. So the blacklist versus the gray list. Now, the blacklist is versus gray list has actually been something that's been pretty confusing to me for a very long time. The blacklist is basically a configuration that's completely overwritten. So meaning that it doesn't even exist in your main configuration. So for example, if you have devel turned on and you don't have it turned on to your main configuration, then all of your configuration none of it's stored in your main configuration. It's all stored in your split configuration. So I'm seeing a lot of comments about lost video or audio. Am I still sharing? I see it. It looks okay to me on Hopin. Looks like it's working. See, I specifically left the boat so I would have better internet. So, okay. Anyway, gray list. Gray list has been the one that's been kind of more of a gray area, no pun intended. But the gray listing configuration basically means that it's only going to be overwritten if it's different than your main configuration. So your main configuration, for example, you may have in your main configuration, you may have configuration for your search, for search. So maybe it's pointing to your production search environment. But you have another configuration file in one of your split folders that overwrites that. And that's what's considered the gray list of the configuration. So I know that I was confused about that for a long time. But basically you want to think about it as kind of more of a conditional split as opposed to a complete split. So these are some of the commands that you would regularly use for configuration import. There's, basically your configuration, you're going to export, I typically use what's in parentheses there. It's kind of the shortcut way. But, you're going to typically export your configuration, and then you're going to import the configuration. But you can also, set different values. You can display config values. You can get the status of configurations to see if there's difference. So these commands can be pretty helpful. There's also some good config split specific commands. And the next demonstration that I am going to go through is basically setting up a split configuration for enabling the devel and kint module, and then we're going to use the config split export commands to actually export those configurations into the appropriate folder. So this is where you would use configuration or the Drush config split export rather than just, you could just manually do all this. There's nothing stopping you. And I think the question in the beginning sort of addressed this, where you could manually move the files over there, but these commands right here will do it for you. This can just be kind of a shortcut, but you can also do all these commands or all of these things manually. Okay, so the next, let me queue up the next GIF here. Okay, so here we are enabling the devel module and the devel kint. And then you can see over here in your synchronization that you have these So now what we're going to do, and we're going to add the devel module and the kint module under the config split. We'll just select devel and select devel kint. And then we also want to get the configuration items along with it. So basically, we're going to grab those same 3 files that we saw in the configuration synchronization that we saw those change. So then, again, that's just comparing that we're selecting those configuration files, and then we're going to save that. And then we're going to go over to the command line, and we're going to run this command. So you can see, did it? No, okay, now it's the next one. That's the next slide. So now we're going over to the command line. We're going to run this command, this split config split export command. And the -y is just basically saying yes. So that was successful. That exported everything. And then if you go look into that folder now, we're going into the develop folder, and you can see that those configuration files are in there. So originally you saw that when we created the split folder or the split configuration, we did not activate it. So by default, you don't want it activated. Just like any any configuration override, you want to determine what's the default. So my default is I don't want this enabled. So if you want it enabled, now this would be a good reason to use the settings.php file. So you're going to edit the settings.php file, just like we did with the system site. We're going to use the config variable, and the first part of the array is the name of the configuration file, which is config_split.config_split.develop. And then the second part of it is the status, so we're going to write the first part of it. And then we're going to go into the other file, we'll see that within that file, there's an attribute called name, and that's going to be the second part of our array. And we're going to change that from false, like it's defined in the configuration. We're going to overwrite it and make it true. So that enables that split configuration. I see a lot of multi-site configuration questions. Unfortunately, I don't have experience using multi-site with config split, so this is not included in the session. But I know that it can be used. I think it's a little bit more complex, but definitely can be done for multi-site. So once we once we have this enabled, so what we're going to do next is we're actually going to wait for this to catch up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set this to false. We're going to set this back to false. And then what we've done is a configuration import, and it's imported the original configuration. So doing the original configuration is actually going to disable the devel and kint module, because this is not in the main configuration. So you can see that devel and kint is disabled. If we come back and change that to true and do configuration import again, now what you're going to see is that the modules are going to be installed and the configuration files are going to be implemented. Okay, trying to keep up with the questions. I'm sorry, but they're going pretty fast. And it looks like we're getting a couple of suggestions on how it can be used for multi-site. So that looks great. That pattern looks like you do config and then you have the site and then the split. So that's great. That's good advice there. Okay, that was a lot of demo there. And I know it went by quite fast, but in the interest of time and of course environment is a config ignore, config split ignore. The config ignore allows you to ignore configurations that might exist in the default configuration. So this is actually a good idea to do for things that your client might want to change on a regular basis. So I've found that config ignore is good for web forms, because web forms tend, the actual building of the web forms are stored as configuration. So if you're editing web forms or adding new web forms, that affects the configuration. So it's, I typically will do an ignore on that. The config split is a little bit more specific to the config split ignore, to the split configurations, and allows you to ignore configurations made by the split module. Okay, so how do you choose what to override? I mean, it's, you have a lot of options here. So how are you going to choose? Are you going to use config split? Are you going to use settings.php? Or are you going to use other things? It really comes down to preference. Your individual project may also drive what you decide. You really need to evaluate what you are, trying to do. What do you want to split? What is different than, than your other environments? And then that may help you decide, what you want to do. If you're just, if you are just doing something very simple and, it's not disabling modules, maybe the config split module is not necessary. It might be overkill for you. It might be something that you can just do in the settings.php file. For enabling and disabling modules, I'm a big fan of config split. I think it's an easier way to manage it than some of your composer options. But it really depends on your preference and the people on your project and what you want to use and how you want to manage it. So there are some troubleshooting, and I didn't end up putting any demos in here because there's actually quite a lot of things that I come across on a regular basis. Some of the issues that you might come across is uninstalling modules or deleting entities, configuration mismatch. A lot of these come up on a regular basis. So, if you're getting a configuration mismatch or deleting entities, usually the error message is not real descriptive, But a lot of times, you know, the deleting entities means that it's trying to delete some kind of entity that has, you know, that has content. So a lot of times that means that you need to delete the content. So if you're like removing a content type and it has delete, it might complain about that. Configuration mismatch might mean that, especially if you're trying to move configuration files into your folder by, you know, without using a config split, you might be putting a configuration YAML file. You may be trying to load a configuration YAML file and it can't load it because the module is not loaded. That has been a typical problem, especially if you're, you know, whether you're using config split or regular configuration management. If you have configuration files and you haven't enabled the module, you're going to get a configuration mismatch because it's going to try to import this configuration and the module is not enabled and it doesn't know what to do with it. Uninstalling modules, a lot of times it's usually around dependencies. If you try to uninstall a module and it's depending on another module that you're not uninstalling, then you'll see errors with that. Okay, so that's pretty, oh, go to the next slide. Well, go to the next slide. There, okay. That's pretty much it. There's actually a lot of information around configuration management. And a lot of discussions around how to improve configuration management. You know, configuration management, there, as of I think Drupal 8.8, there's a configuration API that was put into core. And there's a lot of discussions around how Drupal is improving configuration management. There's an article here written by Dries that's pretty, you know, and I think, you know, this was a great step from going to Drupal 8, being able to move your configurations. You know, back in the old day, we'd had to do it manually. You know, we were manually moving, you know, having to implement these configurations. So now we can keep them in code. We don't have to use features, which makes me happy. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. We do have about 7 minutes. I did get through this pretty fast. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties. I hope everybody was able to get most of this. The slides will be available. I'll put a link to the slides on the session page. Let's see, what else do we have? So there's a question here on when would you use configuration import and when would you use configuration split import? So the split import actually, you know, that would be importing, if you do configuration import and you have that settings variable for that split set to true, then the regular configuration import is going to import your splits. If you don't have it enabled and you want to import a configuration from another split, that's when config split import would be useful. I honestly I don't use it very often, but if you're trying to, you know, troubleshoot, you're trying to figure out, you know, you want to set up your environment to see what maybe the staging environment looks like, so you want to import that configuration, that would be a good use for configuration split import. I'm glad you guys like my background. Okay, so Thomas, I'm not sure if is there any split that's enabled will have its split exported if there's differences. Yes, okay, so as far as the config split, I think this is the answer to your question, but as far as the configuration split export as well, you can, if you were setting up your split for a stage environment and you wanted to do a config split export for that environment to get the files into that correct folder, then that would be your config split export. What is the best approach for combining config and content as far as a feature goes? So when you're talking about content, you know, configuration is really configuration specific. It's not about content. However, I know that, you know, there's confusion around is block configuration or content, and the answer is really it's both, because the block itself is considered content, but where you place the block on in the regions, that's considered configuration. But if you were trying to push content from one, you know, from one environment to another, I mean, config split's not gonna do that for you. There are other solutions for that, and you know, I know Dries' keynote did focus that's something they're going to be working on more in Drupal 10. And you know, that's definitely something that's been a problem. You know, a lot of times the way I've pushed content over the years is, you know, sometimes you just use the migrate module depending on what you're doing. But like in, you know, for example, if you're getting ready to, if you have a live site and you want to launch a new section of your site and it has lots of content, you know, sometimes just the migration module is an easy way to just get the content from one environment to another. Let's see. So say a feature has related content like taxonomy terms. So taxonomy terms, again, the vocabularies are configuration, but the terms themselves are considered content. So typically what I have done is had a module that will create the terms, will actually enable, you know, the module creates the vocabularies first, and then the module, you know, has in the install, it has the terms themselves in there. So that's one of the best ways, I think, to deal with taxonomy. And your configuration for your vocabulary. I've got 3 more minutes. Let's see what else we got in here. Okay, looks like we just have a lot of conversations between you guys, which is great. I'm glad everyone is helping each other out. All right, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. We have a couple more minutes. I want to thank you guys for joining me. It's been great conversations. I'm really happy to see everyone from all over the world. Probably, maybe you may not have been able to be in my session if we were in person. So thank you for joining, and we will see you later. Maybe we'll see you at the a virtual happy hour party coming up. I'm going to see what's going on there, see if we can get together later. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. You can pretty much find me anywhere at Dr. Fusetto on Drupal, Twitter, all those kinds of things. Pretty easy for me to find. All right, I'll see you guys later. Have a great DrupalCon.